In a world where walls fell, empires collapsed, and everyone thought the struggles of history were over, a sinister force crept towards the borders of an innocent country. Russia invaded Ukraine because it thought it was going to join NATO someday?
Well, if that's true, why didn't they invade Finland when it actually did join NATO? I mean, the Finnish border with Russia is almost as long as Ukraine's. Hey guys, I'm George Nixon, a corporate intelligence analyst focusing on the former Soviet Union, and this is Creme de la Kremlin, where we fact-check propaganda's greatest hits. When Putin announced his special military operation, the first thing he spoke about was NATO expansion, lumping it in with various questionable claims to justify his war.
Имея в виду расширение блока НАТО на восток, приближение его военной инфраструктуры к российским границам.
And certain media pundits and commentators agreed with him. But is NATO actually to blame? Alright, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Founded in 1949, it's a club, or some like to say a family.
Daddy has to sometimes use strong language. Daddy.
If one member gets punched, it triggers Article 5 of the treaty, and the rest of them pile in.
You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us!
It's made up of member states from North America and Europe, and with its open door policy, yeah, NATO is expanding, but it's less a conspiracy somehow directed from Washington, and more like a popular nightclub. Countries are literally queuing up to get in, and existing members have to unanimously agree to let them join. Yeah, that's how nightclubs work, right? Alright, so we want to work out what we can trust. Two tools are great for this. Context. What do we know about the situation pretty much for sure, and does the story make sense in light of that? And competing hypotheses. We come up with other potential explanations for what's being said and see which we can rule out. Alright, so for example, your flatmate, Dave, comes along and he claims someone has stolen your cheese. And we go looking for proof of Dave's theory. We open the fridge, we see that the cheese is indeed gone. That seems to reinforce what he said. That's confirmed. Well, maybe there's confirmation bias. Let's have a little think about it. Well, what else could have happened? The cleaner could have chucked it out. Dave could have eaten it himself. Foxes could have taken it. Well, we can rule foxes out pretty easily because, they struggle with fridges, but the cleaner, let's have a little think about that. Well, yeah, the cheese had been there for a few weeks, so maybe it had some mold on it, so we can't rule that out. Can we rule out Dave taking it? Well, Dave's lactose intolerant and we've been home all day, so I think I would have noticed. So we can rule that one out. So that leaves us with someone breaking in unbeknownst to us and stealing cheese only, and the cleaner throwing it out. So by coming up with possibilities and then trying to rule them out, we're trying to avoid confirmation bias. We're trying to avoid becoming a conspiracy theorist and avoid irritating people at parties. So was Ukraine really about to join NATO? Well, let's look at some context. For years, joining NATO was actually unpopular with Ukrainians. Then Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and suddenly NATO looked a lot more appealing. It's funny how that works. But here's the catch. If you're a NATO member, would you really want to vote in a new ally that you have to defend if they're already in a territorial dispute, Crimea, with a nuclear power? Well, that's like volunteering to jump into someone else's bar fight. NATO has kept saying, sure, yeah, Ukraine can join on an irreversible path someday. But look, 17 years of talk, they still haven't offered Ukraine a membership action plan. At the time of the invasion, Ukraine was about as close to joining NATO as a Lukoil executive is to dying of natural causes. Ukraine's membership chances aside, the real question is how much did the Kremlin care about the proximity of NATO forces in general versus the loss of influence over Ukraine specifically? Well, to answer that, you need only compare Russian reactions to the distant possibility of Ukraine joining to the announcement of Finland actually joining later in 2022. Two competing hypotheses. Yeah, we could add more, but I'm just picking the strongest two to save time. So the Kremlin invaded Ukraine to stop NATO expanding on its border, or the Kremlin invaded because it wants influence or dominance over Ukraine specifically. Let's see if we can rule out one of these. Bit of background, Finland was staunchly neutral for decades, and like Ukraine, also had a history of Russian rule. It was actually Russian aggression in Ukraine that prompted Finland to declare its intent to join NATO in May 2022 and formally become a member in April 2023. Bit of an own goal from Russia. Now here's the thing, they've both got pretty hefty borders with Russia. Ukraine has a 1,200-mile border with Russia, and Finland's is 800 miles. In fact, Finland's border with Russia is longer than all of the pre-existing NATO members' land borders with Russia combined. So if NATO expansion is such an existential threat, surely, Russia would have reacted the same way to Finland joining as it did to Ukraine, right? Well, let's see how that went. So let's deal with the rhetoric first. In his war speech in February 2022, Putin referred to Ukraine as historical Russian land, and it's not the first time he kind of insinuated that it wasn't a real country. Meanwhile, shortly after Finland announces its aspiration to join in July 2022, Putin tells a news conference in Turkmenistan that he doesn't mind. There's no territorial disputes. So there's a sense of Russian ownership of Ukrainian territory in the Kremlin. Then there's the existential threat element. In Putin's war speech, and I'll quote the English translation, he said, "This is a real threat not just to our interests, but to the very existence of our state, its sovereignty."
Продолжать просто наблюдать за тем, что происходит, мы больше не можем. Это было бы с нашей стороны абсолютно безответственно.
Pretty heavy going. That was talking about NATO expansion into Ukraine. By contrast, how did the Kremlin view NATO expansion into Finland? In July 2022, Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesperson, told Sky News that Moscow would have to rebalance the situation with its own measures and make the western flank more sophisticated in terms of ensuring our security. Now, what does all that nonsense mean? Basically, they're just going to move some more weapons up. And a few years on, they have, but certainly nothing that would make us think it's an invasion force or preparing for anything like that. So moving back to our first hypothesis, what the Kremlin presented to us as one of the drivers of the war, of the invasion of Ukraine, is this expansion of NATO. Well, you've got the potential expansion in Ukraine, gets a fiery rhetoric, it gets the full invasion. An actual NATO expansion on a similar border in Finland gets very tepid rhetoric and, a little bit of military infrastructure, but certainly no suggestion of an invasion. Look, and this discrepancy is what rules out NATO expansion as being actually one of the main drivers of Russia going into Ukraine.
И где же здесь справедливость и правда? Одна лишь сплошная ложь и лицемерие.
The second hypothesis fits both what the Kremlin was saying and what it was doing. So, final thoughts. Well, firstly, it's worth noting that the causes of the conflict aside, Moscow is trying to use the conflict as leverage in ceasefire talks to extract broader concessions about NATO expansion in general. It's like someone punching you because they don't like your haircut, and then as you're on the ground rolling around and begging for mercy, they steal your wallet. Like, yeah, sure, they didn't plan to steal your wallet, but opportunistically, it's clearly the thing to do. Why waste it? So what's really going on here? Russia didn't invade Ukraine just because NATO was expanding. The Finland comparison demonstrates that. Russia invaded because it wants Ukraine in its sphere of influence, as essentially a satellite state that answers to Moscow. The Kremlin used NATO as one of the excuses to justify the invasion, but their original goal was actually regime change. They wanted to install a government that would keep Ukraine firmly in Russia's orbit.
You're right. It's a bad plan.
Thank you so much for watching. If you found this interesting, please like, share and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. If you have any thoughts, anything you want to share with me, get in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to check out my next video on some of Moscow's sillier NATO claims coming soon. Until then, do svidaniya, tovaryshi.